If you've got a trip to Europe coming up, there are some big mistakes that could cost you money, stress you out, and even ruin your trip. But they're all avoidable if you know what to expect. I've spent the last 10 years traveling extensively throughout Europe, and since my first trip a decade ago, I've helped millions of travelers plan smarter, stress-free Europe trips. When we were full-time travelers, my wife and I saw and made some of the biggest mistakes that travelers run into. We've experienced the cultural differences that catch people off guard, and we've learned simple ways to save money without sacrificing the experience. So, in this video, I'm giving you the ultimate Europe travel guide. The brutally honest tips I wish my younger, more naive self had. The things that might surprise you. The smartest ways to travel affordably. What to pack and what not to pack. And the biggest mistakes that you absolutely do not want to make. For instance, one of the most egregious mistakes I see Americans make when they travel Europe is assuming things are the same. And I mean this in a couple different ways. First, that Europe is all the same. That the travel skills you need, the cultural etiquette, the tipping customs are all going to be the same when you're in Europe. Here's the deal. Europe is a ridiculously diverse continent made up of more than 40 countries and also hundreds of distinct regions with rich histories and norms developed over thousands of years. Yes, it's true, things like the European Union and the Euro have made travel simpler, but there's still nuances and uniquenesses in every different place that you visit. For example, it's incredibly easy to get around via rail in Italy, but in places like former Yugoslavia, bus or car is an easier and faster way to go a lot of times. The second way we get it wrong is thinking things work the same as at home. I see many travelers make costly mistakes when they default to what's normal back home. For example, staying in a westernized skyscraper hotel at a familiar brand. First of all, this typically costs way more, but it also doesn't connect you to the place you're visiting a lot of times. It puts you farther from the points of interest and stuff like that. Meal times are going to vary. Tipping customs are going to vary. You may think you need a rental car, but public transport could be an incredible alternative where you're at. Speaking of rental cars, here's an example of a really costly assumption that I made on our own travels. We had this diesel rental car. And in the USA, the handle for diesel fuel at the fuel pump is usually green. Not the case in many parts of the world. And so when driving through rural Croatia, I filled up our diesel rental car with petrol because I assumed it was diesel. Our car broke down. We pulled up to the pump with the green handle, but I'm pretty sure I put unleaded fuel in this car. This is what assuming will get you. Go ahead and laugh at my stupidity. The next big mistake, and it's good timing because I just ruined a car, remember, is forgetting about travel insurance. So thankfully, one, the car wasn't totally ruined, but we had travel insurance that was able to cover what needed to be covered. And there's all different kinds of travel insurance, and certainly you need to know what's covered and what isn't, but your personal health insurance likely is only going to cover you in the United States. Your little extra insurance that you buy with your plane ticket is only about your plane ticket, usually. This isn't a recommendation for any particular kind of travel insurance, but you should think about what you do in the case of a medical emergency, how to cover your personal belongings if they're lost or stolen, and other things like trip interruption. We also once had a death in our family in the middle of our 6-month sabbatical. We were on a pretty tight budget, and so short notice flights to get home were outrageously expensive, but they were completely covered by our travel insurance. Many travel credit cards these days come with certain elements of insurance as well. One area that always comes in handy is rental car insurance coverage. The important thing to know there is to actually enable that rental car coverage, you reserve the car with that credit card, and then you waive the coverage that the rental company offers when you're booking. Here's a mistake that really gets me: sticking to the tourist hotspots. Imagine saving for years, planning for months, only to miss the real heart of a place. Venturing just a bit further from those crowded streets can transform your experience. It can help you find a more authentic and, in my experience, less pricey atmosphere. Don't forget to research places to eat. And this isn't just all about food. Don't forget to research authentic local experiences. Whenever you take whatever Europe trip you're planning, you're likely gonna walk more than you normally do at home. The big mistake is forgetting to walk before your trip to build up some stamina. I've had several instances where the people I traveled with were not prepared for how much walking we do on a typical Europe trip. Then after day one, they're sore. Their legs and their feet are bothering them, and it slows them down the rest of the trip. Here's the deal. Even fit people struggle with this. Walking just uses different muscles, different than cycling, different than lifting weights, all that stuff. And so if you're not in a walking habit, I'd suggest at least a month or ideally 2 months ahead of your trip, start going on some walks. They don't have to be crazy, right? But take an hour, walk a few miles. This will help build up the endurance in your feet and your legs. And make sure to break in your shoes before the trip too. I know people love a new pair of kicks before their trip. Just make sure to break them in before you leave. Okay, this mistake is the #1 comment about Americans from Europeans who watch our channel. Americans talk too loud. Why do Americans talk so loud? Here's the deal. I grew up in a family of loud talkers. My wife, Allie, also talks a bit loud. Don't tell her I said that. I would say that we are both loud by American standards. Americans in general are loud by European standards. I don't know why we do it. There's speculation about this. One theory is possibly because Americans are more concerned about their personal space. We're used to being farther away from each other, and so basically we shout when we talk. I'm shouting right now. This isn't going to ruin your trip or anything, but if you hope not to stand out or you just want to be respectful, you may consider using your inside voice, even when you're outside. Maybe the most American mistake on this list is to pack your itinerary way too full. The way I usually see this play out is trying to cover an entire country or even multiple countries in just not enough time. You end up cobbling a trip together that's nothing but hitting the major capitals of several different countries. And then you spend half of your daylight hours while on that trip on a train or in an airport or behind the windshield of a car. And I know there's an achievement element to all of this, right? People share their country count like it's a badge of honor. But did you really see those places? Or did you just spend one night there? We're all time strapped and we all only have so many vacation days. I get that. But my preferred way of tackling this, rather than trying to see an entire country or even multiple entire countries in one trip, is to focus on one specific region of a country and go deep. The mistake that probably bothers me more than any on this list is when travelers go looking for America in other countries, or they simply don't respect the local way of doing things. We talked earlier a bit about defaults, right? But what's worse than looking for the things that are default at home is carrying around a mindset of, oh, we don't do it that way at home, or, oh, that doesn't apply to me. Having this mindset that America is just superior. Friend, I want to urge you, behave as if you're an invited guest in someone else's home. If you've ever been in a shoes-off household and your host asked you to remove your shoes, what kind of guest would you be if you just said no? Not a very good one. Likewise, make an effort to respect the local customs and the local people. Leave your arrogance at home. Don't fall into that trap of constantly comparing things to the way they are at home. It's a surefire way to miss out. Theodore Roosevelt, a great American, once said, "Comparison is the thief of joy." And making comparisons or not respecting someone else's culture or way of life is the exact kind of thing that can give American travelers a bad reputation. Travel is such an incredible opportunity to grow as a human being. It's like accelerated personal development if you allow it to be. But you have to be open-minded and you need humility. Behave as if you're a guest in someone else's home because that's what this is. Another massive mistake in my experience is not trying to learn at least a little bit of the language spoken in the place that you're headed. Many Europeans are multilingual, and it's true a lot of people speak at least some English, but learning just a few basic survival phrases of the country or countries you'll be visiting can make life a lot easier, and in my opinion, it's respectful to at least try. My advice is to focus on practical, real-world phrases that you'll actually use. I'm no polyglot, but I can get by in many languages with basics like hello, thank you, excuse me, toilet, beer, and one that comes up more often than you'd think, asking for the check in a restaurant. That's exactly why I recommend Rosetta Stone. Their lessons are built for real-world conversations, and they even equip you with contextually helpful phrase books for situations like ordering food, asking for directions, and checking into your hotel instead of games and random vocab lists. But you can also go way beyond the basics. No matter how you learn best, they've got you covered. If you're visual, they have image-based lessons. If you prefer audio, there's listening and pronunciation exercises. Personally, I'm a speaking and listening kind of guy, and I appreciate that I can hear how something should be pronounced, say it myself, and then get real-time feedback on that pronunciation. I like that the lessons are short and flexible. You can do them on app or desktop, and you can fit them into your schedule pretty easily. If you're ready to get started, click the link in the description or scan the QR code here on the screen for over 60% off an unlimited lifetime subscription to Rosetta Stone, and you'll get access to all 25 languages forever. Big thanks to Rosetta Stone for sponsoring today's video. But even if you learn a few key phrases, that's not going to prepare you for everything, because for the uninitiated, Europe has some quirks that might surprise you, like street names. Let's say you're on foot looking for your accommodations for the first time. Your host sent you check-in instructions and said, "We're on Kirkstraat." You get to what you think is Kirkstraat, but you're not positive, so you go to check the street sign. You know, the sign on the street that tells you the name of the street. Surprise, there isn't one. There actually is one, usually, and it's not far, but it's also not super obvious. In many places throughout Europe, there are parts of town where street names are actually on the sides of buildings. Not 100% of the time, but if you can't find a street name, look around at the buildings first. I'll be honest, this comes up more than you'd expect, even if you're using a GPS. Well, congratulations, you found your accommodations, and now to get to your apartment. Your host said it's on the first floor, number 117. You enter through the door on the ground level, you search everywhere for number 117, and nothing. What the heck? Well, in most of Europe and the UK, the ground floor and the first floor are not the same thing. The first floor is the first level above the ground floor. And by the way, don't be surprised if your building doesn't have an elevator. Elevators aren't uncommon by any means, but there are plenty of buildings with 4+ floors and no elevator. So here's one of the number one reasons we don't check bags when we come to Europe, and why we recommend carrying on instead. This is the way to our Airbnb.
A few minutes later.
As you can see, I'm still climbing. Like when one of your handrails goes straight up, that's not usually a good sign. You know what else you should mentally prepare yourself for? Not having air conditioning at every moment of every day. This depends on where you're going, of course, and it can be a bit regional, but don't be surprised at all if your hotel or apartment or bed and breakfast doesn't have air conditioning. Now, if you're in Southern Europe where it gets blazing hot, this may not be as much of a problem, but in places like, let's say, Belgium, they may only need AC like a few weeks a year. And then is it even worth it to own an air conditioning unit? It's much more common to just leave your windows open at night. And their windows tend to be a little bit different, to where you can open them or crack them and just kind of leave them cracked at night. I actually love those windows. Personally, I want them for my house. And this is another one of those kinds of things. If you know you need AC, just be conscious of that in the booking process. You can filter your Airbnb searches by whether or not they have AC. Something that surprises me is the number of people who watch this channel and aren't subscribed. If you're getting value out of this video or any of our videos, please hit that shiny subscribe button for more content like this. Another thing to look into before your trip, and I've seen this really upset some people, is what days things might be closed. In many countries, Sunday is truly treated as a day of rest. Most retail stores, supermarkets, and even some restaurants and cafes will be closed. It's not uncommon for smaller shops and boutiques to take the day off and give their employees a break. This can be shocking to a lot of travelers, especially coming from the USA, when we can get groceries any day of the week, but it just is what it is. Now, personally, I love the idea of culturally honoring a true Sabbath and day of rest, if you will, but gosh, if you're a traveler in a small town and you just want to find a place to eat or you need some groceries, it can be surprising and honestly very frustrating. I remember once Allie and I went to a Spar in Vienna on Sunday. It was open, but there were certain items that could not be sold on Sundays. I think she just needed like shampoo or something, and that blew our minds. We could buy cheese, but we couldn't buy soap. Sundays can also be tricky. Many museums, galleries, historical sites, choose Monday as their closing day, especially if they were open over the weekend. So big tip with this is just to plan around these days. Make sure if you're really excited about a certain place and there's attractions or museums that you want to see there, double check the days those things are open and align your itinerary with ensuring you can enjoy them. We've covered a lot of cultural differences, but there's one thing bigger than all of them that keeps people from traveling to Europe, and it even ruins the trip of those who do make it across the pond: the cost. Many people assume it's just too expensive to travel Europe, but that is complete nonsense. With the right strategies, you can explore Europe comfortably without breaking the bank. My wife and I once traveled full-time through Europe on an average daily budget of $50 per person per day, and truthfully, you can do it for much less than that. Here's the thing: we didn't have to stay in a bunch of hostels or have a lackluster experience in order to pull off that very reasonable budget. Sometimes we even got to fly business class and stay in 5-star hotels. And so in this video, I want to share easy ways you can save money on your next Europe trip without feeling like you're making major sacrifices. But first, anytime I make a video with Europe in the title, at least a handful of people show up with their metaphorical pitchforks to remind me of this. Europe isn't one place like Disney World. Europe is a continent made up of more than 40 countries and tons of distinct regions with vastly different customs and norms. And of course, they're right. And that leads perfectly into one of the easiest ways you can save money on your Europe trip. Choose cheap destinations. When you look at the cost of living throughout countries in Europe, there are vast differences there too. Take Switzerland and Bulgaria, for example, very different situations. And the same can be said about the cost to travel. Choosing a cheaper destination is one of the least complicated and most forgiving ways you can save. I'm not telling you not to visit all the places that you've dreamt of, but if you're on a very tight budget, and let's say, for example, you're itching for a Mediterranean climate, you could trade beaches in Italy or Greece for beaches in Albania and save a ton of money and possibly even get to splurge more without feeling it. When you travel is huge too. Another great way to save is traveling outside peak season. Pricing for things like flights, lodging, and certain other travel expenses fluctuate based on demand, and demand tends to fluctuate seasonally. So, if you can swing it, aim to travel in the shoulder season or off season of your desired destination to save money and, I really like this part, avoid crowds. Getting too far into the off season can sometimes be problematic because certain things might be closed, but do your research and you'll be fine. If you plan to visit a lot of sites, city passes and bundles can be a great way to save money. A lot of times, these passes even include skip the line benefits and access to public transport. For example, if you're visiting Rome and you plan to hit several of the famous sites, you might want to get something like the Roma Pass, which includes access to many of the sites within Rome and extensive access to Rome's public transport network for a full 72 hours. I'd also recommend looking for free attractions. Many cities have cool free things to do that can be just as fun and interesting as paid attractions, and balancing your time between free and paid experiences is an easy way to save. For example, there are several great free museums in London. Taking a free walking tour is another great example. Now, when you do a free walking tour, tips are strongly encouraged. These guides need those tips, but it's still going to be cheaper than a $30 museum entry. Also, just walking from point to point, people watching and looking at cool architecture is a great way to save. My first ever trip to Europe, my buddy and I were running pretty low on funds by the end of our 5 weeks. We were in Berlin at the time when we adopted what we still refer to as the Berlin method, which is where we point to an interesting looking building on the horizon, walk to it, paying absolutely no money to enter it because we're not entering, admiring it up close, and then picking a new building somewhere else and doing it all over again. That may not be for everyone, but it really helped us enjoy where we were at without having to spend a lot of money. Most people can easily cut down how much it'll cost to use their phone while traveling by not purchasing the extra plan with their home carrier. And there are a few ways you could go about this. You could just keep your phone on airplane mode and only use Wi-Fi. I did that for a long time. You could also buy a local SIM card when you land, but I generally find this to be a hassle, and you can sometimes get scammed doing this. So I like to recommend using an eSIM. It's an awful lot like getting a local SIM card, but you don't have to go anywhere or talk to anyone or physically put anything into your phone. I link my preferred option below, including a discount code. A great way to take your money and throw it straight into the toilet is eating at touristy places right next to the big attractions and touristy sites. The closer you are to major tourist sites, the more likely that you're dining in a tourist trap. I know there's exceptions to this. For example, one of my favorite pizza spots ever is very close to the Uffizi Gallery in Florence, but in general, just walk a few blocks away from the crowded touristy areas. And consider a great way to save money is adapting to local tastes. Drink beer in Czechia, but wine in France. Eat the pasta specific to the region you're visiting in Italy. Order soup in Croatia. Learn the tapas scene in Spain. Eat bigos in Poland. Doing what the locals do will not only lead to you learning something and having a better experience, but it will usually save you money too. All right, let's talk about lodging. My favorite type of place to stay in most parts of Europe is a family-run mid-range hotel or bed and breakfast. It's a great way to meet and support locals. And although tools like Booking.com and Google Hotels are a great way to find good places to stay, you can often save big money on your lodging simply by booking direct. Third-party sites like Booking.com tend to take a big cut, like 15 to 20%. And unfortunately, it's just a fact of life for most of these family hotels in order for them to remain relevant and competitive. Well, you can often get a discount by finding that hotel or bed and breakfast site and booking with them directly. If the price on their site is listed as the same, I would say don't be afraid to send them an email and simply ask for a discounted rate. The worst they can say is no. If you're from the USA, you might be very accustomed to tipping. You might also be used to our new tipping shame culture where at the kiosk, even if all you did was order a coffee, the recommended tip begins at 20% and goes up to 25 or 30. You nervously pick the lowest one and now you feel like a jerk. Let me tell you something. In much of Europe, servers and restaurant workers are paid a living wage. So a good way for you to save money is to make sure that you're not tipping too much when you don't need to. This totally varies by place, but I recommend using the free app Globe Tips to understand the tipping customs and the etiquette for wherever you're at. And listen, if you want to leave a huge tip, go for it, but this is a good way to save. The biggest cost for most people's Europe trips is the flight. We're talking a third of the budget or more. And cutting down the flight cost, getting from $1,000 or even $1,500 to like $500 or less is a great goal and very attainable. One of my favorite ways to do this is using flight deal services like FairDrop to be alerted about cheap flights to your desired destination. Basically, you receive an email alerting you that there's a cheap flight to where you want to go, a link to that flight deal on Google Flights, and info about what it typically costs. That's it. Basically, you're paying them to pay attention to the prices for you. I've taken several trips to Europe because of flight deal alert services like this, where I paid less than $500 per person for round-trip flights to Europe. I'm also a big fan of using points and miles from credit cards and have taken several very close to free flights as a result of points that we earned by simply paying our bills and normal life expenses on cards that earn points. This year we visited Belgium and the Netherlands using points, and we had to pay just like $200 in taxes and fees for our round-trip flights. Last year, I took our family of 3 on a trip to Austria and Germany, and we flew business class both ways. These flights alone should have cost $27,000, and all we had to pay was taxes and fees. Another way to save is actually a mini course that I made on how to save money traveling Europe. It's a 90-minute deep dive that covers the 7 big Europe money mistakes travelers make and a breakdown of how anyone can easily save $1,000 or more on their next trip to Europe. I go into so much more detail there about booking lodging and how to find a great place and give screen shares and examples. We talk about how to find cheap flights with walkthroughs on points and miles and recommended credit cards. And I also include several exclusive discounts for some of our top recommended travel products. These are the exact tips that I wish I had had when my wife and I first set out to travel Europe for way less without sacrificing our experience. If that sounds interesting to you, click the link below to learn more. But even if your budget is dialed in, there's one more area travelers really struggle with: how to pack. In this next section, I'll share the most common Europe packing mistakes people make and how to avoid them. I'm going to cover the right and wrong type of bag to bring, clothing mistakes you need to avoid, Things you don't want to forget and stuff that, in my opinion, you just shouldn't waste your money on. The first mistake is big, and it's something that I see catch a lot of travelers off guard. It's not realizing they may want to pack differently than on a typical domestic trip in the USA. I see a lot of travelers on their first trip to Europe bring a giant suitcase bursting at the seams with stuff they're not even going to use. We're going to talk later about luggage, but let's address the elephant in the room: overpacking, specifically clothing. It's really common to bring more clothing than you need. It's not your fault. The best way to avoid bringing too much is to take 5 minutes and make a plan. A couple years ago, my sister met us in Prague. It was her first trip to Europe, and I remember explaining to her how to pack for a 10-day trip to Europe and just how daunted she was at first by the entire premise of needing to be intentional about what to bring. But she did it. We made a plan, and she fit everything she needed for that trip into a small, simple carry-on. And you can do that too if you want to. So here's a few quick tips. And we also have several free packing checklists linked below that you can download. You always want to look into the specific countries and the specific regions that you'll be visiting, as well as the weather for those areas beforehand. We tend to check a month or so out to get a general idea of what it's normally like, and then check again much closer to the trip, like a week out, to make sure we're packing exactly what we need. We once lived out of carry-on suitcases for 6 months straight, and we had to make it work for Europe in the winter, only to end up in blazing hot Thailand and Singapore just a few weeks later. It's a challenge to pack for multiple climates, but it can be done. And the best way to navigate this is to focus on clothing that is versatile and could be used in a variety of scenarios. Don't forget, layering is your friend. And instead of packing 10 days of separate outfits, build an assortment of tops and bottoms that could mix and match together, so you've got multiple options for what could go with what. Look up the rule of 5s. I may only pack 5 tops for a 10-day trip, and then just plan to stay at a place with a washing machine one time. Toss a few items in on a quick cycle, hang them up to dry overnight, and boom. I know some people are really bothered by the idea of doing laundry on vacation, but honestly, when you don't bring much to begin with, it's really not hard and it really doesn't take much time. When it comes to shoes, most guys can manage on 2 pairs, and since ladies' shoes generally pack smaller, you can get away with 2 to 3. My wife brings 3 usually. Really important for most people's Europe trips is a good pair of walking shoes. Comfort is key because you're gonna walk more than you think, probably. My second pair tends to be for running because I really like to run when I travel, but these could also be a nicer pair for like if you go out to a nice dinner. Allie's 3 pairs are typically walkers, some type of sandal, and then something nicer that could rotate seasonally. Don't forget to consider the cultural norms of where you're headed and plan ahead for any religious sites you may want to visit. Generally, this is going to mean shoulders and knees covered. Allie likes to travel with a scarf like this one for these exact types of situations. Now that we've streamlined some clothing, you might be thinking about how you'll make all this fit in your bag. So let's talk about another mistake, which is not opting for the packable or travel-friendly version of things. For instance, it's nice to have a bag to put a few things in when you're out and about that isn't a giant purse or a 20-liter backpack. My go-to is a packable day pack. These are clever little backpacks that fold down so small they fit in the palm of your hand, and yet they expand to hold everything you would need for a day trip. They're pretty affordable and very handy. This is a must for me. I also always recommend traveling with a jacket. Even in summer, a good lightweight rain jacket is a must. And I know many of you in our audience have said a light windbreaker is your go-to when you travel. However, jackets can take up a lot of space, so opt for one that packs down very small. The key feature to look out for would be one that packs into an internal pocket. It packs into itself, so it takes up minimal space when it's compressed. I know some people love and swear by neck pillows. Those take up a ton of space. If you have to have a neck pillow, go with an inflatable one. And of course, go with the travel-sized version of toiletries. Keep it under 3.4 ounces if you're carrying on. If you've got a specific product you need to bring with you that doesn't come in a travel size, get some silicone liquid tubes that you could pack them into. A huge mistake is forgetting things you need. Most important, you can't forget your passport. You're not going to get very far without it. And I know that sounds obvious, but I'd also recommend bringing a printed backup copy of your passport and your driver's license, along with other important documents like reservations, and travel insurance. I tend to just put these in a Ziploc bag and bury them somewhere deep in my luggage. Don't forget any medication you need to bring with you. And in my experience, it can't hurt to have the actual prescription in case that medicine gets flagged in security. You're also going to need a way to charge any electronics you're bringing with you. Personally, I prefer to use a simple universal adapter that covers many different countries and continents. On several of our trips, we hit a lot of different places in one go, and I just like to have options. But if you're only going to one place, you could also opt for a simple single converter. This little guy is specific to most of the EU. It came in a big package of a bunch of different region-specific adapters. This is my preferred universal adapter. It's by a company called Epica, and I like it because you can charge up to 6 devices at once. It's got AC power, 4 USB slots, USB-C, and it's Wirecutter's #1 pick. It's only like $20, and a good set of plug adapters is gonna be cheaper, but I like that this is one thing that's going to cover me in most places. I also recommend bringing a long phone cable. Sometimes outlets in hotels or Airbnbs are in weird places, and having a longer 6-foot cable just makes it easy to have your alarm clock or white noise or whatever you need right there near the bed. I also like to carry a lightweight power bank with me when I'm out and about so that my phone doesn't die when I need it for Google Maps or communicating via WhatsApp. Guys, I have a confession to make. I have gas. Gear acquisition syndrome. The truth is, most travelers, especially new travelers, have gas. And I love gear. I've recommended a bunch of gear on this channel. I prefer quality over quantity, and I want a small amount of multifunctional, life-enhancing things over a large amount of phony, single-use things. That said, there's certain stuff that you just don't need to bring with you. Let me run you through a few. Physical guidebooks. I love guidebooks. Look, they are great for research, but I don't pack them anymore. Take notes or get the digital version of the book. They just take up too much space in your bag. Specific use case travel items. Perfect example, microfiber towel. You might need one. Emphasis on might. These are great if you're staying in a hostel, you're going to a beach, visiting the thermal baths in Budapest. But unless you know you need it, I would just save your money. Passport cases and holders. The problem with these is you almost always have to take your passport out of them anyways. Money belts. Safety is important, right? I think you should consider safety. Pickpockets are a real thing, especially in crowded areas. But in my experience, a decent alternative to money belts is 1, just not keeping your wallet in your back pocket or leaving your phone on the table. 2, opting for pants or shorts or travel clothing that has zippered pockets. Or 3, going with something like a small sling you could wear on the front of your body. Most important is just to have situational awareness. I'm not telling you not to get a money belt, but there are alternatives contrary to a lot of what you hear out there. Super technical and rugged gear and clothing. I see a lot of first-time travelers investing tons of money in technical hiking boots and hiking pants, stuff like that, for a trip that they really don't plan to do much hiking on. If you do plan on hiking, ignore me. But if the majority of your trip will be in cities, not everything you own needs to be made of Gore-Tex. On this topic, one area I would say not to skimp in general is your socks. Stop packing basic, crappy cotton socks. You're likely going to be walking more than at home, so I'd recommend investing in good socks that will wick moisture and help prevent blisters. This is by no means an exhaustive list. On the flip side, here are a few simple and cheap things I never regret bringing with me. Apple AirTag. This is to keep track of my luggage in case it's lost or stolen. Dryer sheets, because static cling is my arch nemesis, and it also keeps my bag smelling fresh. A pen. For filling out forms, I always seem to have to borrow a pen. Bring a pen. HDMI cable. I know this sounds weird. Takes up very little space. It's certainly not a necessity, but it's always nice if you want to stream something in your room. Probably the worst packing mistake you could make on a trip to Europe is this, or this, or this. Listen, this catches people by surprise, and especially if you're coming from the United States, where it's super normal to bring a massive suitcase with you everywhere. But hear me clearly, I'm not saying a checked bag is a mistake. By all means, bring a larger bag if you need one. But if you don't need one, and based on the data of what a typical Europe trip for an average traveler looks like, you should seriously consider downsizing. I know I'll get a bunch of comments about this, Put down the keyboard. Listen, if you disagree with me, that's fine. Do what works for you. My goal here is simply to bring awareness to someone who hasn't thought about these things before. Here's what works for me and my family, and based on my experience, what should work for a good 80% of people. I prefer to carry on to Europe specifically, and here's why. Not everywhere you stay is going to have an elevator. You got to contend with stairs and cobblestones. And if you're staying anywhere near Old Town, you may not be able to be dropped off right at the front door where you're staying, and you may have to walk a ways. If you're visiting multiple countries or cities, you'll likely be moving around via rail or bus or inexpensive short-haul flights. The right bag for those situations, in my opinion, is one you can easily manage yourself and carry if you need to. Right? If you got to hurry through the train station to catch your train, you got to go up and down stairs to change tracks, step up onto the train platform. It's tougher with a 50-pound checked bag. Plus, then you got to find space in the compartment. Right? I'm not saying it can't be done. Of course it can. I just don't want to do that. And so if you are carrying on, you haven't done that before, or you haven't done that internationally before, just be advised there are some rules you definitely can't miss. First of all, size requirements. Now, don't just take my word for it. Please do your research for your specific flight. But generally, the carry-on requirements for most US airlines is 14 inches by 22 inches by 9 inches. We'll put the centimeters on the screen as well. And for international airlines, it's even smaller. That 22 inches becomes more like 21. These measurements include wheels and handles, by the way. Make sure to check the fine print. Some bags, they market the internal dimensions, but really you need to be focused on the external dimensions. There's also not just a size requirement, weight is an issue as well, which is a surprise to a lot of people. Be sure to check with your airline, but that's usually somewhere in the 7 to 10 kilogram range, which is only 15 to 22 pounds. Ouch. So what does this look like? 9 times out of 10, I am personally a backpack guy. I like backpacks because I only want to mess with one bag. Whatever terrain I'm going over doesn't matter. And especially important, I can go hands-free. This is a big deal these days because I have a very energetic toddler who doesn't walk, she runs. Maybe you're not a backpack person. I know many of you who like to pack carry-on only prefer roller luggage, and I don't blame you. It's really a matter of personal preference. Just don't forget roller luggage tends to be heavier, and if you're flying any European airlines, the weight component is super important. So, for you backpack people, I bought, tested, and ruthlessly compared 10 of the best backpacks on the market to declare one overall winner. You can check that out here. And for those of you looking for a super lightweight roller bag, I did the exact same thing for those right here. Thank you so much for watching. Happy travels.